This is the Rhodes Center podcast. I'm Mark Blythe. I asked Greene, who's a fellow of the Rhodes Center and someone who writes for the Financial Times and is basically an all-round good fellow, to help me understand what this post-COVID economy is going to look like. I like Megan because she's very much a kind of empirical economist. As I say in the intro to the program, she sticks her head out the window and actually looks at what's going on and tries to make sense of it. So we set up this conversation as a competition between two different models of what's going on. One, we open up, we'll all be fine. One, we open up and we will not be fine. Discuss. I think this is worth listening to. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Megan.
Hi there.
Hey. So you're a fellow of the centre that you no longer get to visit because even within the northeast of the United States, we don't travel anymore. So It's great to have you back on the Rhodes podcast. We used to do a lot of this stuff when we were doing Alpha Chat together. So it's wonderful to talk to you. I wanted to bring you back onto this podcast at this point in time because you're one of my go-to economists. You're not a theory head. You actually stick your head out the window and look at what's going on, and you look at different types of data and all the rest of it. And we're in the middle of this crisis, and I want you to try and help me and help people listening to this make sense of all this stuff. So it's a lot to dump on you, but are you willing to play?
Yeah, I'm game.
All right, cool. So here's how I'm going to set this up. I want you to just start commentary once I set this up. There's a giant natural experiment being run in the United States just now. And in the states of Texas and Georgia and Florida and other places, and increasingly everywhere that they're opening up, they're kind of making a bet on two epidemiological models. The one that they're betting on says that actually the underlying rate of infection is much bigger than we think. The denominator is much bigger than we think. QED, the numerator, is smaller. Lethality is less. We need to get to herd immunity anyway. And damn it, we're going to do it. It's the damn the torpedoes approach, right? Yeah. And then there's the other one that says, which seems to be the one which is the trend of most of the models, and in conversation with public health people, this is the look they give you if you do the other one, right? Which is, sorry, that's not true. In fact, hardly anybody's been infected. And if we don't manage this incredibly well, we're going to have second waves, we're going to have second and third shutdowns, and that's really going to hurt more than what we're doing just now. What do you think? How do you think this is going to play out? I'm not asking you to be right about the models, but play out both scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we don't know which of those two arguments is right is because we just haven't tested enough people and our tests aren't accurate enough, right? So in reality, no one actually knows. There is so much about this virus that we just don't know. We don't even know if you can get immunity or for how long or how strong that is. So herd immunity as a concept, that might just not ever work. Same with a vaccine, that might never work either. So I tend to be more sympathetic to the second argument, though, just given that there's so much uncertainty. You know, the idea that we're just going to let everyone back out and hope that there isn't a massive surge in new infections, that seems pretty risky to me. But more important than policy on any of this, I think, is how everybody else feels about it, right? So, if you believe that the first argument, that actually we're being let out specifically so that many of us can get sick, so that we can develop herd immunity, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, nope, no thanks. I'm not that much of a team player. I want to be one of the last people to get this virus, not among the first. And, some people aren't thinking like me, the people, on the beaches in Florida that you see pictures of. But I think a lot of people are thinking that way. And if you look at some of the micro data that my colleagues, including Raj Chetty and others at Harvard are putting together, they're taking huge data sets. They're getting a lot of them from private companies. They're cleaning them and just putting them online for free. And one of the data sets is spending. So they're getting credit card information. And it shows that, in Georgia, for example, when they opened up, spending was completely flat. So they haven't had a surge in new cases, but that's partly because no one really bought this. People weren't all surging and going out to bars and restaurants. So I think the confidence piece is more important than the policy piece even. And generally, I think a lot of people are going to have to figure out how they personally feel in terms of their safety and engaging with the world now. And that's not going to be uniform within a state or across the states. But I do think that if there is a new surge, that's going to kill confidence even further, right? If we have these intermittent lockdowns, as another colleague of mine, Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, has suggested we might have, if you get a new surge and then have to lock everyone down and then the new cases fall and then you let everyone out, that's just going to push the return of confidence further out. And that means that, getting any kind of demand back in the economy is going to take much longer.
So if we look at that, I call that the inverse field of dreams problem. You can open it, but will they come? Right.
Right.
And you're quite correct. The evidence so far shows that, with shopping malls, you got 20% of expected traffic, right? This sort of thing. So is it the case then, if we look at these unemployment numbers and we look at spending and we look at credit card spend and everything else, are we actually already in a Great Depression?
I think we probably are. It depends on how you want to define depression specifically versus recession. And I think that's all semantics. It doesn't really matter to the person who's lost their job, right? It's terrible either way. So I do think we're definitely in a recession. I think it could well be a depression. And as you say, right, if we open up and shopping malls don't get the kind of foot traffic that they got before, and restaurants have to include social distancing and demand just doesn't come back, I think we're going to have another wave of bankruptcies. So the first one we saw was when we shut down, but a whole bunch of companies took advantage, rightly so, of the programs that were designed for them to carry them through this short period. They got these bridge loans. And I think when we go ahead and do open up, a lot of those businesses are going to discover there just isn't much demand for what they have to offer. And so even if policy suggests that people could go out and live like normal, people might not. And so then I think we're going to have another wave of bankruptcies. So for people looking at the jobless claims data, which was 2-point-something million people last week, there's been a lot of rejoicing amongst economists. First of all, that's a huge number still relative to what we're used to. But secondly, I think we've got another wave of these bankruptcies and further layoffs coming down the line.
So exactly as you point out, the assumption that everyone went into with this was we'll be lucky if we get a V. It'll probably be a U in terms of the recovery pattern. But the temporality on this axis is basically 6 to 8 months. So the idea behind paycheck protection, the idea behind paying 80% of wages as they do in Europe, the idea behind bailing businesses in the United States was these are fundamentally sound entities, generally speaking, even if we allow for the huge corporate debt binge, which has been going on for the past 10 years. Their balance sheets are on it. They were doing fine. So we're just giving them this bridging finance to build the bridge to get over the chasm. The problem is the chasm keeps expanding.
Yep.
Right? So at which point do standard commercial entities and standard balance sheets start to basically fail, right? When something that was fundamentally solvent, doing well, in fact, 6 months ago, Delta Airlines, right, might actually just not come back. How do we think about that?
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the airline sector, which has been hit really hard, but this is going to happen across all kinds of industries. And in the US, our bridge financing was really for 2 months, because at the beginning of this, people thought, well, 2 months, that should be enough time. It's obviously not enough time. We've all been locked down for longer than that already. So we're going to need more fiscal stimulus. We're going to need more bridge financing. But at a certain point, some of these industries are never coming back, right? Bricks and mortar retail is Macy's opening its doors again? That's pretty unclear. Or a lot of other, competitors, J.Crew's already filed for bankruptcy. A bunch of other companies have in their wake. I think a lot of these industries are just never coming back. And that's partly why our system in the US of relying on unemployment insurance to help people is a good one, because you don't keep them attached to their employers, which gives us more flexibility. If those employers are never opening their doors again, it doesn't help to maintain an attachment like they do in Europe, actually.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
Yeah, I do think, though, that, the Fed has agreed to buy up lots of corporate debt. It actually ends up only being about 4% of investment grade corporate debt at the moment. That's not a game changer, but it's no coincidence that the day after the Fed announced that, the S&P 500 took off, right? That was the turnaround point for equity markets in the US. And the Fed, I don't think they would have moved so much in such a short distance to then say, oh, we're not buying enough, but we're just going to let everyone fail now. I think they're going to go ahead and continue to support the investment grade corporate debt market. But for high yield debt, the Fed's buying a little bit through ETFs. It's about 0.3% of high yield debt. That's junk debt. It's not much. Is the Fed going to scale that up as we see a whole bunch of defaults and a lot of companies get downgraded? The Fed really doesn't want to be holding high yield debt. So that's where I think a lot of these dislocations are going to come out in the markets.
So let's go back 10 years. We find ourselves in the world of the post-financial crisis. There's kind of structurally low rates built into it. There seems to be no way to generate inflation, even if you try hard. And corporates took advantage of this and basically issued tons and tons of debt at basically an effective zero or negative rate for the biggest corps. And then forgetting what they did with it, buybacks or whatever, right? They now have a huge debt pile. Now, there's a very straightforward moral hazard game that you're playing here, right? So the first one is too big to fail as a moral hazard game. Then the next one is zero interest rates. Why would I not load up on debt? And is the third act basically the Fed now, whereby they're going to catch every falling knife that there is, because ultimately they're trying to put a floor under asset prices? And if that includes corporate junk and everything else, that's where they're going to go? Is that where we're headed?
I think that is where we're headed, but I think that when it comes to junk debt, the Fed does have limits. They really don't want any of that stuff. I mean, if I had asked, people I know at the Fed 6 months ago if they would buy corporate debt, even 4 months ago, they would have looked at me like I had 40 heads, right? They didn't really want to do that either. But that was investment grade debt. They really don't want to be holding this junk.
Right.
And also, there's a great irony that the Fed has spent the past year and a half warning everyone about all, this corporate debt bubble we have, particularly leveraged loans. Jay Powell gave a speech dedicated to that topic about a year ago. And now they're going to have to go in and bail all these guys out. I think there is a real moral hazard problem.
But isn't it kind of ironic in the sense that the Fed's policies effectively fueled that bubble and then they start warning against it? And now at this point, it's like, well, we're not going to buy junk. But if it's not junk, we'll prop up that market. I mean, at some point, capitalism's meant to clear. And it seems that we're determined to not let this happen. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think so. At some point, you take risky bets and sometimes they go bad and you're supposed to take losses when that happens. The problem for the Fed is that has severe implications on growth, which impacts inflation and employment, which are, their mandate. And so. But
if we're already at 30% unemployment, what do average Americans have to lose, right? The vast majority of stocks were held in a handful of accounts. 20% own 80% of the stocks, and there's a Pareto skew within that, so it's the 80-20 again in that. Those assets have been kind of bailed. Stock markets are booming, relatively speaking. The Fed will do whatever it takes to do a Draghi on this one. As far as ordinary Americans are concerned, who gives a damn? I mean, 30% unemployment. There was a report on the BBC yesterday of upstate New York, a 5-mile-long queue for food banks. And it was all middle-class Americans with reasonably new expensive cars. I mean, I see this enormous disconnect whereby we're talking about supporting asset prices and buying junk, whatever. 30% unemployment. What's going on with that disconnect? Why do they care about that so much, given what's going on in the real world?
Why do they? So, they care about it because if markets don't function, which is what happens when you start letting things fail, they seize up. I think the Fed's worried about the knock-on effects for growth and then the knock-on effects of that for unemployment and inflation. But unemployment for Joe Sixpack, who doesn't own any stocks or bonds, maybe through a pension, but generally not involved in the markets. But, I think you're right. There is this disconnect between the markets and the economy. I actually don't think it's based on fundamentals, though. I think there's some rationality in it, right? In the equity markets, at least, right? It's the FANGs and Microsoft that are driving this rally. They're not reflecting what anybody thinks about the economy. And in fact, if you're going to make a bet right now, betting on some of these high tech companies, as you and I sit here on a Zoom call, that doesn't seem like a bad idea. Also, healthcare has driven the markets much higher too. So there, and it makes sense again to bet on healthcare in this pandemic. So I do think that, there's this huge disconnect between what's going on in the markets and what's going on in the economy. But to your point, Joe Sixpack doesn't care if, CLOs end up going bankrupt and there are a bunch of defaults. They don't. The Fed's just worried about market functioning, which is its job. And if you start letting these things go under, then you might get the market seizing up like you did in early March.
Right. So you made an interesting observation I hadn't heard before earlier on, where you said that the advantage of an unemployment insurance scheme is it breaks that link with the employer. And what the Europeans have done is essentially paycheck protection, which effectively keeps the firm whole, on the assumption that way you avoid the startup costs, right? Yep. And they're obviously two very different models. What I've been hearing in DC is that given that the big New Deal, whatever stimulus program the Democrats want is going to go away, isn't going to happen, what they're trying to do now is bring in the European system. Would that be a mistake?
No, so it wouldn't. It turns out we already have the European system, just nobody knows about it. So more than half our states have work sharing programs like they use in Europe. It's just most companies in those states have no idea. And so it doesn't occur to them to try to keep this link between employers and employees. And I would say, the US system works really well, the unemployment insurance system, because our labor market is so flexible. So I do think for high turnover, low productivity sectors, it's pretty effective, right? So waitresses and waiters, there's tons of turnover in that. It's a low productivity role. It's not a big deal if you just sever that link and find someone new. It happens all the time anyhow. There aren't huge startup costs. But the longer this lasts, the more that we're moving out of those hourly service jobs that are low wage, low skill jobs in a lot of cases, and moving into higher productivity areas, and then actually maintaining a connection between employers and employees is useful to reduce the startup costs, as you said. So if you had to choose one for the US, I think that I would choose unemployment insurance. If you had to choose one for Europe, where there's more labor legislation protecting workers, making it harder to fire and also to hire people, it's better to maintain a relationship between employer and employee. But actually in the US or in Europe, we don't have to choose just one. We actually have work sharing. So beefing that up, I think, is a good second step.
But let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. The figures that you've seen and I've seen are that 1/3 of restaurants, given the fact that they're cash flow intensive, they have no in cash, that their employees can walk flexible labour markets, and that people may be very nervous, particularly if there's multiple rounds of this virus, to go into restaurants. So 30% of them might never come back. Yep. Think about other things, like my favourite example of this is therapy massage, right? How are you going to do that in a kind of non-contact world? So of the 80 million hourly employees in the United States that basically constitute these flexible labour markets, that's going to be the most affected. So I want two thoughts from you on that. Number one, does that bespeak a kind of new structural unemployment for those workers? And if it does, is that especially problematic because they were the ones that were at the wrong end of the wage distribution to start with?
Yeah, so I do think that the natural rate of employment is going to go up. It's going to be higher than it was before. It had come down pretty significantly over the course of the last recovery. It's going to go up for sure. And that's necessarily going to be the case as certain sectors just don't come back. These people are going to have to retrain. That's actually another potential benefit of relying on unemployment insurance, actually, because you can make requirements in order to collect your unemployment insurance. And so if we can say, you know what, your industry is just not coming back, you need to retrain and retool, show us that you've gone ahead and gotten those skills so you can change sectors and move into one that will be coming back. That could be helpful. But you're also right. We've essentially ended up with a load of people, knocked on their butts, having never gotten back on their feet in the last crisis. It's these low hour, low wage jobs that are mostly in the services sector. So it's people who are producing the stuff that we like to consume now, who never saw any wage gains over the course of the last recovery, and now have been the first ones to be laid off. And so they weren't in a good position going into this. They're really going to suffer now. And they're now going to have to go ahead and figure out how they can retool for a new industry. And we're really bad at this retooling, reskilling piece, by the way, in the US and in actually most developed countries, because from a political standpoint, that takes a while. You've got to send someone to classes, for example. There's no immediate payoff, and so no one's really willing to get behind it. So that is something that we should also be focusing on, because a lot of these companies are just not opening back up. And a lot of these business models won't work. So if you look at restaurants, if restaurants are thinking, okay, we might have 25% less capacity because we have to have social distancing, that's pretty optimistic. With a thin margin business like that, does that make any sense? Maybe not. And then there's an entire supply chain that goes into restaurants that gets affected by that as well. So there are tons of knock-on effects from these things too.
Absolutely. So one of the ways, in fact, the only way that we're paying with this, because we don't actually ask either rich people or corporates to pay taxes anymore, is through debt and the issuance of debt. So we're talking earlier about a giant private sector debt bubble. And we now have essentially 20 to 30% of GDP being debt financed by governments to cover all this stuff as we go through. Now, as an economist that both you and I know and like, called Richard Koo, who has a very simple way of explaining this, the balance sheet recession model. And in a sense, if we think about this shock as not a supply and demand shock, because ultimately if supply is one side and demand the other, you're kind of calling it an everything shock. I think of this whole thing as a kind of very weird analog of a massive technology shock. Right? Imagine the sort of electricity was invented overnight, and then 6 months later, everyone had to adapt to it, right? So like, holy shit, we've got gas lighters. What do we do with this, right? It's all completely like whacked. It's like this sudden tech shock, right? And these sectors aren't coming back and all this. Then if you do a Richard Koo story on this, what happens is the private sector, given all its debt, is going to delever. That's baked into the cake. They're going to shrink, right? They're not, any money that they get in the door is going to go into debt reduction. Now, what Richard's argument is the private sector, by definition, must lever up, and it's already massively levering up. So the question is, how far can this go? How far can you have a deleveraging private sector trying to recover and a massively up-leveraging public sector taking the slack before we get to a point where it really does get kind of fiscally unsustainable to do so? Is that on the horizon, or are we in a kind of MMT world where big countries at least don't need to worry about this?
Yeah, people keep asking me if we're doing MMT. It's not.
What's your answer? What's your answer to that?
No, we're not. Not really. We're doing kind of a strange bastardized version of it, though. And I think it's right, too. I think for the US, the UK, Australia, a lot of these countries that are considered safe havens, that issue their own currency, do we need to worry about our deficit or debt burden? Or no is the answer. I mean, when people ask me how we're going to pay for this, the answer is really clear. Just borrow the money. Deficit financing. Central banks have said, they've promised rates are going to stay really low for a really long time, for the foreseeable future. So should we worry about racking up all this debt at incredibly low, in some cases negative rates? Absolutely not. The worry is, I guess, that if you just keep borrowing like this and spending all this money, you're going to generate inflation. And again, there I would say, don't worry about it. If we could generate some inflation, that would be fantastic. I think the Fed would be the first institution to celebrate. But the reality is we had QE before. Did we generate inflation? Only in asset prices, but not in terms of, real consumer prices. I think all the reasons why we didn't have inflation before, like technological advancement, changes in the labor market, those are here to stay and will continue to be factors. So, we had inflation off the back of 2 world wars. Some people say, well, we should worry about that then. But we bombed everyone in those 2 world wars, and afterwards, or in one of them at least, and we had a lot of destruction. And afterwards, you had to go and rebuild all this stuff, and that went into the real economy. You got inflation off the back of this, but we haven't destroyed anything this time around. And so I just don't see inflation as being a problem. If we get inflation, it might be because we're all learning how to work with fewer resources. And so you could have a kind of productivity driven boost in inflation. That's a good kind of inflation. I would welcome that. Insofar as we're worried about the debt, one way to get out from a debt burden is to inflate your way out of it. Now, it doesn't feel good, particularly for lower classes, but in terms of your debt burden, it's not a terrible thing. So I don't think we need to worry about inflation. MMT is basically saying we're not constrained by our deficit. And I think that's true, actually. I think, most economists would agree with that. It's not like we have to collect taxes to then go and pay for stuff. We pay for stuff and collect taxes separately. That's sort of a bonus. And it's a way that we deal with demand in the private sector taxes. But I think they say the real constraint is inflation. And I'm saying we don't need to worry about inflation for a really long time.
Let's follow through on this. So 2019 and more recently this year, Olivier Blanchard, the ex-IMF head economist, did a piece that was widely reported, crudely reported, but accurately reported exactly as don't sweat the debt. And his basic argument was, if you look at the key differential in solvency for states is Piketty's RNG, but they mean different things, right? It's the rate of growth in the debt stock relative to the rate of growth in the economy. And what he found was when you cut it into deciles, or every 10 years, that in 4 out of 5, G is always greater than R. So essentially, you're eating your own debt, and that's good news, right? And when you have structurally low rates and structurally low inflation, that's an even better environment, so don't sweat the debt. I think that's right, and I think everything that you said is right, but you are also one of my go-to people for European politics. Tell me about Italy.
Yeah, so I didn't say that the Eurozone was among those countries that could just print money, even though their borrowing costs are going to stay really low for a long time because there are huge differences within the Eurozone. And Italy, got hit really hard by this crisis immediately faced potential export controls on food and PPE and medical supplies from France and Germany. So much for solidarity within the Eurozone. The Commission didn't step in with a kind of compromise, but that was on the table, which was astonishing and not a good sign in terms of discussing how the stronger countries in Europe are going to help the weaker ones again. I mean, Greece, Italy, Spain, they just haven't had the fiscal space to spend like Germany has. And you see that in the state aid loans that have been approved. Half of them are German because Germany has the money to provide them. So, the Eurozone has never been great at coordination on a fiscal level. And sure enough, they haven't announced much that has really shown that they're going to step in and help Italy, Greece, Spain, maybe even Portugal when they need it. Any discussions have involved some kind of talk about, moral hazard and conditions. That is entirely inappropriate with this kind of shock that was no one's fault. Greece has handled it really well. It's being held up as a model, and yet they're still going to need money to pay for some of this. Yeah. A fifth of their economy is based on tourism. Are tourists going anywhere this summer? I don't think so. So they're going to need some help. There is this talk of a recovery fund that is being put together. And, Germany and France have suggested it. And basically, it's through the EU budget. So it is actually fiscal transfers. There doesn't seem to be specific conditionality on it other than that you have to use it in part for green investments that can help countries hit their Green New Deal targets. So there's a sustainability aspect to it, which is great. I just wonder if Merkel has agreed to this just to play nice with Macron, knowing that it will never get passed by other member states because there's a bunch of opposition to it. But I also wonder if it will be macroeconomically significant. So even if it does get passed, you might get a little bit of a transfer. And politically, that is a big deal. But is that going to be a game changer for Italy, which needs a lot of money? I sort of doubt it. Well, there are too many ifs and we don't have enough details on it. They're still putting it together. So it's maybe the kind of beginning of a kernel of promise of some kind of solidarity actually being shown in the Eurozone. But I have my doubts.
A lot of the press has been reporting on this as a Hamiltonian moment, referring, of course, to Alexander Hamilton and the Bank of the United States taking on the debts of states. When I heard about it, I immediately thought about Hamilton the musical. Everybody thought this was really awesome for about 6 weeks and discovered there was nothing really there. So maybe we're looking at that type of Hamiltonian moment rather than the first one.
It's possible. I mean, if what you're looking at is Italy getting a bit of a subsidy, someone has to be on the other side of that, right? Somebody's got to be willing to pay. And maybe Merkel has decided that actually it's not in Germany's best interest to have Southern Europe stuck in this prolonged downturn and saddled with debt. Yeah. And that would make sense, except for Merkel's never come to that conclusion before. And there's been a massive debt crisis in the Eurozone before. So maybe if that's her view, maybe we are shifting towards a new model. But I just wonder who's going to raise their hand. It's not going to be Hungary or Poland who's going to say, oh, don't worry about it, we'll pay for Italy. There's no way. So, I think I'm not convinced it will be passed.
All right. Megan, I know you have to go. You've got a birthday party Zoom to go to because this is what we do in the new normal. It's been great to talk with you. Let's check in again in a month and see where we are. How about that?
This sounds good. Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right. See you soon. Bye.
All right. Bye.
This episode of the Rhodes Center podcast was produced by Dan Richards. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. If you like us, rate us on iTunes and help others find the podcast as well. For more information, go to watson.brown.edu/Rhodes. Thanks for listening.